Do you remember how weird the 1990s were? Not as garish as the 1980s perhaps, but twice as overconfident. Technology was literally changing beneath our feet week by week as this constant stream of new technological innovations were launched. Each aimed to sweep the last one aside as fast as possible. Within a few short years, video games changed completely. They went from these dark, black and white, technicolor nightmares to something that became increasingly more complex and increasingly more competent, something that looked more and more like visual artwork. We could literally see the technology, both the hardware and the software, evolving before our eyes. And this wasn't iterative new releases, this was a complete reinvention each time. In the video game console market, Sega was seeking to overtake Nintendo, and it was doing this by focusing on making its games brighter and faster, more eye-catching and trying to appeal to a teenage audience, by shaking off the kid-friendly Nintendo brand. Perhaps no character embodies the pace of change and the radical attitude prevalent in the early 1990s, like Sonic the Hedgehog. He was marketed as someone with a cool attitude, just the right combination of a serious and carefree. And the character of Sonic struck a nerve with mainstream culture in a way that many other corporate mascots of the time could only dream of. Sega, rival console manufacturer Nintendo, had always been behind their Japanese rivals, struggling to find a way to one-up that pesky plumber. But finally, in 1991, to several good but not quite there contenders, Sega launched Sonic the Hedgehog as their first true frontman. He was bright, vibrant, energetic and fast. Sonic was arguably the first video game platform to truly challenge Nintendo's hallmark franchise. Sonic the Hedgehog, well, it's a flawed game. In fact, from a historical perspective, it feels more like an engine tech demo, as its concepts have all been so flawlessly superannuated several times over by excellent sequels. But the 1991 original on the Mega Drive, or the Sega Genesis depending on your region, it lit a spark that radically changed the video game industry forever. To explain why, I suppose you'd need to revisit the video game scene of the 1990s. Following the video game crash of the 1980s, two international console makers clearly led the pack, the Nintendo Super NES and the Sega Mega Drive, or Genesis depending on your region. In most of the world, however, the Super NES wasn't just a SNES, it was a Nintendo. If you wanted to play a video game, well, you plugged your cartridge into your Nintendo. And the best-selling games on the SNES was Super Mario World, a platformer that sold in excess of 20 million copies. The beloved third game in the Super Mario series was the template for all video game platformers to base them on. Now, the genre had been around since the late 1970s, and with every video game generation, it was getting more and more proficient, introducing concepts such as scrolling movement, varying environments, or attempting to imbue enemies with true artificial intelligence rather than just set patterns of movement. Now, there were many variants on the topic, such as Mega Man, run and jump and shoot, Alex Kidd, run and jump and punch, Metroid, run and jump and shoot and explore an interconnected map, DuckTales, run and jump and bounce on a pogo stick. The concepts were varied and there were many more getting equally more bizarre. But largely, almost all of these were based off the template laid down by Nintendo. There was a sense that to succeed, a console needed a platforming mascot, and the king of the platformer was Nintendo, and Mario specifically. Shigeru Miyamoto's team had, over a couple of iterations, seemed to perfect Mario's movement. It was fast and responsive, his jump was high, and the mechanical template was clearly set. But then, in 1991, for the first time, that pervasive worldview was probably shaken. The new engine developed by Yuji Naka and his team, well, it could scroll in all directions, not just left to right, which was novel but not exactly groundbreaking. But then for the first time, terrains were not flat or simple triangular shapes. They were uneven, curved, and sometimes even looping. Sonic visibly shifts up and down as he moves over bumps in the ground. And most clearly of all, there is retention of momentum. Unlike Mario, who has a set jump height and speed, Sonic's controls are entirely dependent on his movement and surroundings. It is hard to explain now what an innovation this was at the time. Sega milked it for everything they had, later labelling it as blast processing, a unique selling point on the console that's more about a cool catch name than any real gameplay innovation. but Sonic's movement and physics were designed from the start to behave halfway between a traditional platformer and a pinball machine, as evidenced by some early levels such as Spring Yard Zone. At any point while moving on the ground, players can press down and they will roll into a ball. In this state, they can pick up speed when rolling down hills, gathering increased momentum and earning the ability to leap to unimaginable heights. Sonic's jump height, his speed, his very physics were responsive to the world around him. Many people have since described Sonic games under the motto, "Gotta go fast," but revisiting his early games on the Sega Genesis, it reveals that this is a fallacy. Sonic was sold on his speed compared to Mario and other platformers, but he isn't actually any faster. From a standing start, running left to right, he's actually fairly slow and unresponsive compared to Mario's somewhat twitchy controls. It takes the Hedgehog a few moments to accelerate to his full speed. It is possible to move faster, but in order to do so the player needs to make use of their surroundings. Speed is not the point of the game, it's a reward for playing it well. The innovation that Sonic the Hedgehog brought to the market and spawned a franchise with, it wasn't speed, it was momentum. And this was accompanied by a vibrant soundtrack from Masato Nakamura, bassist from the Japanese band Dreams Come True. Another misconception of his early platform games is that the soundtrack's a selection of beeps and bops. In 2010, whilst attempting to hark back to the Hedgehog's glory days by trying to make a true sequel to the original 3 games, Jun Senu composed a bright and bouncy chiptune soundtrack which, in my opinion, completely misses the point of the originals. On the Mega Drive, the music was held back by the limitations of the hardware, but at all times it maintains this strong, heavy, this rhythmic beat that has either an up-tempo swing or a jazzy flair. There's always something interesting rhythmically going on, a panache so prominent it isn't completely surprising that it then caught Michael Jackson's attention. Revisiting video games of this era, it always strikes me that from this point onwards, it became much more common for characters to behave as though they had weight and presence in the world. The complex interaction between the sprites begins to indicate that this is not just a space within which players move around, but one where they physically engaged with and have an impact upon. Sonic is by no means solely responsible for this shift, but it is a landmark moment in the evolution of the genre. The 2D era of video games on the consoles waxed and waned in the 1990s. The rise of 3D graphics meant that this era came to a fairly ignoble end by the millennium, but recent indie games have harked back to the glory days of 2D platform gaming. In the intervening years, however, there was a wave of similar mascots designed to compete in the space between the Hedgehog and the Plumber. Bubsy, Aero, Awesome Possum, Mr. Nuts, Gex, Rocket Knight, and many more spawned in this game's wake. And with the rise of three-dimensional space, the Blue Hedgehog's fortune have been rather more mixed. But the original 2D Sonic the Hedgehog game was by no means the first great platformer to rival Mario, but it arguably was the first to revisit the fundamental mechanics of platform gaming. By introducing a truly responsive new engine that allowed free-flowing gameplay, it opened up new possibilities in level designs. Ideas that often sadly would not be truly explored until the sequels that worked off the concept this game introduced. I would encourage revisiting this, however, for the opening level, Green Hill Zone Act 1. Well, it was play-tested to the nth degree during this game's development, and it shows. The first level is a masterclass in design. Later levels are a mixed bag. Marble Zone and Labyrinth do everything in their power to slow the player down, direct them into narrow corridors or swamp them into dreaded underwater sections where the player's momentum is subbed. But it would not take Sonic Team long to expand upon this first attempt. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 arrived only a year later in 1992, and by then the team had perfected their vision. Larger and broader levels, with branching paths, designs more suited for Sonic's unique gameplay, and the innovation of the spin dash to make gathering that first burst of momentum easier. There were several sequels to Sonic the Hedgehog, and throughout the early 1990s, the template laid down by this game were built into a franchise that appeared unstoppable. There were comic books, adventure books, television series, anime, McDonald's toys. The blue blur got everywhere. In retrospect, I never feel the urge to revisit this original game. The Mega Drive sequels, and some 2D iterations since then, they do everything this one did but better. However, Sega keeps re-releasing the original entry because they recognise its cultural significance. Ports and remasters have been produced for the Sega Saturn, the PlayStation 2, GameCube, Xbox, PC, Game Boy Advance, iOS, Nintendo DS, Wii, PSP, 3DS, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, PC again, and Nintendo Switch. I've been capturing footage from a couple of these versions, but arguably it's difficult to recapture the magic of Sonic on his original console. Potentially, the 2013 Taxman and Stealth Mobile port with a game controller would be fantastic. Getting this remastered in widescreen would do so many favours to this game. Taking away the hardware limitations of the original without using emulation would be great, but at the moment there's been no luck getting that off the mobile phone ports. In Europe, Sega didn't just compete with Nintendo, but they overtook it, and a certain blue blur was prominently visible at the front of the charge. So when analysing the early days of video games, Sonic's arrival really was a significant moment in history, and one definitely worth checking out if you aren't familiar with this already. I told you the 1990s were weird.